So far we've talked a lot about complete sentences, incomplete sentences, and I've mentioned phrases occasionally. So I want to in this video talk about a very important kind of phrase that comes up a lot on this test, and that is the participial phrase. And I think the best way to learn what these are is to see examples. So first look at the first 4 sentences here. Kicking in the can as he walked, the boy worried about the broken window. The boy, kicking the can as he walked, worried about the broken window. The boy, kicking the can as he walked, worried about the broken window. And finally, the boy worried about the broken window, kicking the can as he walked. Notice they're all contained as the exact same words. The difference is where this phrase is located. This phrase is an example of a participial phrase. Why it's called that? Because it begins with what's called a participle, which is a fancy way of describing words that have an ing at the end of it. Or, as we'll see out in a second, an ed. Sometimes ed words are participles, other times they're not. I won't get into that. Keep it simple for the purposes of this lesson. So participial phrases are phrases that begin with ing words and sometimes ed words, like kicking. So notice they're really free floating. They can go anywhere. So here, kicking in the can as he walked, the boy worried about blah, 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 blah. So this is describing what the boy is doing. How about this? The boy, kicking the can as he walked, worried about the broken window. Notice these two are very similar. The difference lies in the fact that one has commas and one doesn't. And we'll get into the difference about that in a little bit, but they're both acceptable. Notice here again, this is pointing to the boy, describing what the boy is doing. We can also, this one's a little bit harder. I think students struggle with this one the most. This can also be at the end of the sentence. Notice we've got a comma to separate it from the main sentence. And when you have a comma to separate it from the main sentence, that's an indication that this phrase is referring to the subject of the previous sentence, that first noun that you see in the previous sentence. So here, the boy, again, is the one kicking the can. So all 4 of these are equivalent grammatically, but stylistically and on the things they emphasize that there are some differences. But those are your participial phrases. They can move around. The key, as we're going to see, is they have to directly point to a noun that they modify. If there's any ambiguity, if there's not a noun they could be describing, that's a problem. And we'll see examples of that in a little bit. Again, most of the time, these participial phrases are going to have an ing to start. Sometimes they'll have an ed. So for example, wiped out by flame strike, his board didn't look very promising. Or his board, wiped out by flame strike, didn't look very promising. I suppose technically you could have the third option. You could have his board, wiped out by flame strike, didn't look very promising without commas. That's a little bit weird, so you maybe wouldn't see that very often. And having a participial phrase with what's called a past participle with this ed at the end of it, having at the end of the sentence, I guess might be possible, but very not standard, something you wouldn't see. So when you got the ed, it's much more limited. That's why you typically see the ing version much more often. The one thing I want to say about the ing version, a lot of students get tripped up on this. They think the ing implies present tense. And what's even more confusing about this is called a present participle. So you would think, oh, okay, present participle, present tense. But notice here in these sentences, this is all happening in the past because the boy has worried about the broken window, right? It's something happening in the past. It's not happening now. If it were happening now, it would say the boy worries about the broken window. So you might say, well, wait a minute. How do I have past tense with present tense? How does that make sense? Well, the issue is resolved by realizing that kicking really doesn't have a tense. What it actually shows is simultaneity. It's showing that 2 things are happening at once, that as he worries about this thing, he kicks the can, right? Or as he worried about it, he was kicking the can, right, at the same time. So it shows simultaneity, not tense. So don't get tripped up on that. You don't have to change this to make this past tense or anything. It's totally fine as written. Let's look at an example. So 13, typically the ice sheet begins to show evidence of thawing in late summer. This follows several weeks of higher temperatures. So here we want to combine sentences. So everything we did in the previous video about sentence combination comes into play here. So let's see which choice works. Notice in A, we have this participial phrase following the main sentence. Typically, The ice sheet begins to show evidence of thawing in late summer following several weeks of higher temperatures. So, perfect. I mean, this is just like this fourth example right here, where the participial phrase comes at the end. It's separated with a comma. It's describing the ice sheet that following several weeks of higher temperatures, the ice sheet begins to show evidence of thawing. So logically, it makes sense. It's nice and clean, nice and concise. So we like A, but we always check all 4 choices. So let's keep going. B, and this thawing follows several weeks of higher temperatures. I mean, not terrible. I guess it's letting us know, what specifically is following the high temperatures, and it's the thawing. So grammatically, it's okay. But again, in terms of concision, in terms of the one that's shorter, most direct, we like choice B. How about C? And such thawing follows. Okay, we've swapped out this for such from B to C. Maybe it's okay, but again, A is just much more concise. We'll go with that one over the others. D, and this evidence follows several weeks of higher temperatures. It's not clear that this is really, I guess this is referring to the evidence of the first part, but it's a bit odd considering really it's the thawing that's following the higher temperatures, not really the evidence. We would need a comma here. This falls under the same issues as B and C anyway. So the one that's shortest, most concise, and grammatical is A. I do want to note, don't just immediately pick the shorter one, because maybe sometimes the shorter one has got a grammar error in it, which makes it wrong regardless of how short it is. But do note that the shorter one, if you're choosing between 2 or 3 that seem to be all grammatically correct, go with the shorter one. It's typically going to be right. So participial phrases can connect sentences efficiently, as we saw in this one, as long as there is no ambiguity. And let's take a look at some examples of what I mean by that in the next lecture.